Now it's time to go over attacking and combat. Attacking is the primary means of dealing damage to units, war camps, and settlements. War camps, settlements, and most units in the game during their respective turns can be used to target and attack each other. For units, attack abilities are distinguished by the melee red straight arrow or ranged red curved arrow icons, as you can see here and here. Melee, ranged. These icons appear just after the ability's name. Attack abilities will also be listed at the top of each unit's unique unit abilities section. This is the unit abilities section on the unit's reference card and within their respective player guide details. There is no default attack that all units receive. Instead, an attack ability must be explicitly stated by the unit in order for that unit to have the option of attacking a target. For example, the Wandering Spirits unit has no listed attack ability. As you can see, there are no red arrows, curved or straight. Therefore, this unit does not have any ability to attack, which is also why their attacks per turn unit stat is 0. By default, performing an attack ability will take an action. Some attacks may also require a payment or sacrifice to activate and utilize. In this case, the Phalanx's Javelin ability requires paying 1 supply in order for that attack to be performed. In all cases where an ability has a payment or sacrifice requirement, these resources must be paid and resolved first before the rest of the ability can be executed. An attack ability must target 1 or more units that are within the attack ability's targeting range. Although similar, the handling of how units target and attack war camps or settlements will be different from how units target and attack each other. I'll go over targeting and attacking and assaulting war camps and settlements later on. For a melee attack, these types of attacks must target a nearby unit that is also on the same elevation. Therefore, the Phalanx unit can only target and attack if that other unit is within 1 space and also occupying ground. The Phalanx cannot utilize their Spear ability in order to target and attack a unit that is occupying sky terrain. Any attack that has the red curved arrow is a ranged attack. A ranged attack can always target units both on the ground or in the sky. A ranged attack arrow will also be segmented, and there will also be a number listed just after the arrow indicating the number of spaces that can be targeted from the attacking unit. In this case, the Phalanx's Javelin can target and attack any unit within 2 spaces, whether they be on ground or sky. When using an attack, that unit, war camp, or settlement is going to make a number of attacks based on their base attack per turn stat, plus any additional bonuses that the unit will receive depending on the ability that they are using, the terrain that they are occupying, and other situational factors. In this example, the Phalanx normally gets 3 attacks and by default 1 damage each versus any unit when using their Spear attack. However, they would get +1 additional attack versus a mount unit if the unit that they were targeting had the mount attribute. An example of how situational bonuses could apply and enhance a unit's attack, let's take a look at the formation ability of the Phalanx. It reads as follows. This unit gains +1 attack per turn for each nearby ally Phalanx unit. Enemy mount units that target and attack this unit gain -1 attack per turn during their turn. According to formation, if this Phalanx had a nearby ally Phalanx next to them, and they engaged in an attack, they would receive +1 attack in addition to their base 3 attack. By keeping a formation with the phalanx, they could effectively do 4 attacks per turn against an enemy unit. And if that enemy unit had the mount attribute, that 4 attacks per turn would jump up to 5 attacks per turn. The remainder of formation comes into play in a defensive nature, in that if an enemy mount unit were to attack this phalanx, they would lose 1 attack per turn during their turn, whenever they target this phalanx with their attack. Now, as a reminder, if a squad unit were to have any damage on them, therefore missing some degree of squad members, for example, this phalanx now only has 8 members. Because they have any damage dice on them, they lose 1 attack per turn. It doesn't matter about the amount of damage they have accumulated. Any damage dice on a squad unit means they lose 1 attack per turn. Now, to go over some of the attacks and how to interpret them, this phalanx's spear attack deals normal damage and gains +1 attack per turn versus mount units. I'll go over check presence later. This phalanx's javelin ability is a ranged attack of up to 2 spaces. It requires paying 1 supply to use and deals normal damage. If the javelin were targeting a mount attribute unit, it gets +1 attack. Now, with regards to damage, all damage is based on the default base attack damage. Units don't have a base amount of damage listed on their cards. That is because all units, war camps, and settlements have a base attack damage starting at 1. Whenever the heart with the crossed arrows piercing through it icon is seen, that is the base attack damage icon. Tangus's axes gain +1 to his base attack damage when using the axes ability. That means that although Tangus does 5 attacks, Tangus gets +1 base damage to each of those 5 attacks. Effectively, Tangus gets 5 attacks at 2 damage each instead of 1 damage each. To compare, the phalanx's spear gets 3 attacks per turn at 1 base damage, and that damage type is normal. Whenever damage is being dealt, that particular source of damage will have a designated damage type. There are 8 types of damage that can be dealt to units, war camps, and settlements. These damage types are normal, magic, fire, thunder, ice, acid, life, and death. When it comes to dealing damage to war camps or settlements, the type of damage does not matter and is always treated the same, whether it be life damage, death damage, or normal damage. This is because war camps and settlements have no defensive stats. They are not vulnerable, resistant, or immune to any damage type. Units, on the other hand, do have defensive stats which can increase, decrease, or negate the amount of incoming damage received based on the damage type. Any effect that causes damage to be dealt can only have 1 associated damage type. For example, if Tangus the Unchained were to activate his Fire Frenzy ability, Axes gains the option of dealing normal damage or fire damage. However, it cannot deal both with the Axe's ability. The controlling player needs to decide whether to deal normal damage or fire damage. Every attack per turn made by an attack will have the same declared damage type. If an attack ability has multiple targets, this same selected damage type must be declared to all available targets. If an attack states any damage type, then any one of the 8 possible damage types can be selected. For example, a level 3 war camp can deal any damage type when it uses its attack ability. With regards to the defensive stats of units, some units will have vulnerabilities, some units will have immunities, and some units will have resistances to certain listed damage types. For vulnerabilities, anytime an instance of that damage is being received by that unit, that damage is increased by 1 per instance or per attack. Meaning, if 3 attacks of ice damage were being dealt to the hot metal golem, they would receive 3 attacks, 2 damage each, because they are vulnerable to ice damage. Now, a vulnerability on a squad unit does not work in the same way. They are indeed vulnerable to, for example, thunder damage for the phalanx unit. However, because they are a squad unit, they can only receive a maximum of 1 damage per attack. If 3 attacks of thunder, 1 damage each thunder, would be dealt to the phalanx, that would be increased because they are vulnerable to thunder damage to 3 attacks, 2 damage each. However, the phalanx would only accumulate 3 damage because only 3 members would die, because a squad unit can only take a maximum of 1 damage per attack. So there is a limit to how much damage a squad unit can receive. The hot metal golem has 3 different immunities, one of which is fire damage. So Tangus the Unchained, if he were to utilize his Fire Frenzy ability to enhance his axes with fire damage and attack the hot metal golem with fire damage, that damage would be completely negated and no damage would accumulate on the hot metal golem. Whenever any unit with immunities to a damage type receives any instance of damage from that type, that damage is effectively negated, and that attack or source of damage is considered unsuccessful. With regards to resistances, some units will have some damage type resistances. Like with vulnerabilities, resistances decrease the incoming damage by 1 per attack. So consider the phalanx unit. Their spear deals normal damage, and they get 3 attacks versus a unit that doesn't have the mount attribute. If they were to attack Tangus, they would get 3 attacks at 1 damage each by default. However, Tangus resists normal damage, and because Tangus resists normal damage, those 3 attacks of 1 damage each would amount to 3 attacks, 0 damage each, because Tangus has resistance to normal damage. Be sure to keep in mind the terrain occupation effects that can occur depending on the positioning of your units on the battle map. Although Tangus resists fire damage and would normally be okay to occupy desert terrain, as desert terrain only deals 1 damage at the end of turn to its occupant, because desert terrain also gives the occupying unit fire vulnerability, this fire vulnerability would override Tangus's resistance to fire damage, therefore taking and accumulating 1 damage from fire. In the event that multiple resistances and vulnerabilities would stack of the same damage type, each pairing of these would eliminate each other. So, for example, if Tangus were to receive another source of fire resistance, although the desert terrain would give fire vulnerability, a second instance of fire resistance would ensure that no damage would accumulate from the desert should that occur. Although opposing vulnerabilities and resistances can cancel each other out for a unit, vulnerabilities of the same damage type cannot stack and further increase the damage. Therefore, ice damage being dealt to the hot metal golem, for example, while they are occupying snowland terrain, which also grants ice vulnerability, will not stack. So 3 attacks of ice damage will still deal 2 damage each, 6 total damage to the ice golem, regardless if they are occupying snowland terrain or not. Also keep in mind of the terrain that units occupy. For example, if the phalanx were occupying forest terrain, their melee spear attack would gain +1 attack per turn. In addition, any ranged attacks being made into a unit that occupies forest terrain would lose 1 attack per turn. These types of compounding combat bonuses and penalties can affect the overall outcome of attack damage results. So a final example of how combat can be handled, we have here the adept archers occupying the plains terrain on the ground, and we have the begotten witches that are occupying sky terrain just above. It is the adept archer's turn, and they're going to use their bow ability in order to target and attack the begotten witches occupying the sky terrain. Now, bow has a targeting range of up to 2 spaces. The begotten witches are 1-2 spaces away, and because bow is a ranged attack, the adept archers can target anything within ground or sky terrain, so the begotten witches are a valid target for bow. The adept archers are at full health. They have no damage dice on them, so they're going to get their full 3 attacks per turn using their bow. Their bow ability also grants +1 attack versus flying, and the begotten witches has the flying attribute, so those 3 attacks are going to get +1 attack versus the begotten witches. In addition, because the begotten witches are occupying sky terrain, any range attacks made against them is going to get +1 additional attack. So the adept archers using their bow ability is going to get 3 attacks, +1 versus flying, and +1 because the begotten witches, the target of bow, is occupying sky terrain. So that's going to be 5 attacks, 1 damage each, and the damage type will be normal. So the begotten witches accumulate 5 damage onto them. Just a helpful tip, when declaring the results of an attack to another player, it's done in the following format. This is just a recommendation. You declare the number of attacks, the damage per attack, and then the damage type. So for example, in the case of the adept archers attacking the begotten witches, it is 5 attacks, 1 damage each, normal damage.